The video you are about to watch is from an old woodworking magazine that I published during the years of 2003 to approximately 2006. This was a very unique magazine. It was purely video content and it was distributed on DVDs. The magazine ran for approximately 3.5 years, and then due to financial concerns, we simply had to terminate the magazine. We moved on to other things over the last roughly 15 years. However, there has been a request to resurrect this content, so I've gone through the trouble to get the equipment, the products, everything I needed in order to bring this content back to life to share with everyone. Here on this YouTube channel, we'll be putting up approximately 100 to 120 of the original stories that appeared in that magazine. The magazine was called Woodworking at Home Magazine, and it was truly one of a kind in the world. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and please tell your friends about them. A lot's been said over the years about safety on table saws. Much attention is given to blade guards and blade covers, feather boards, zero clearance inserts, and splitters. However, very little is ever said about the importance of an outfeed table. Now keep in mind that safety on a table saw lies greatly in part to controlling the workpiece throughout its entire cut. Now, any board that's more than a couple of feet long, you need outfeed support. Now, of course, you can buy those stands that have the rollers on the top, such as we just demonstrated here, but even those, if not properly adjusted in height, can create additional problems. Consider for a moment as I was feeding this large sheet of plywood through. If I would have got halfway through that cut and that roller stand was either too high or perhaps too low, I'm going to lose control of my workpiece, and that can create a very serious condition. So what we're going to be doing on this project is creating a very large outfeed table for our table saw. Now in this particular design, this outfeed table is going to serve two purposes. Of course, it'll serve as the outfeed support for our work as we're feeding long boards through. But I also use it, as we did on our old table saw, we also used it for an assembly bench, finishing, sanding, and a variety of other purposes. So we do want it to be a very strong outfeed table because it serves double purpose. It's also going to be a workbench for us. So we're going to get started by ripping all of our plywood at this time and cross-cutting it to its proper length. To cut down the size of a plywood panel, one of these extruded aluminum straight edge guides, along with a circular saw, makes quick work of it. The thickness of our torsion box, which will serve as the fixed portion of the outfeed table, needs to be the same distance or thickness as it is from the top of the surface to the top of this piece of angle iron. Now, if your saw has a different configuration on the back, you'll have to account for that and come up with your own way of fastening that fixed portion to your table saw. So I've carefully measured mine, and it's coming out that I'll need my rib thickness to be about 1 7/16 of an inch. Now I have to account for two thicknesses of that 1/2 inch plywood as well. That's why I'm measuring from the top down to there. Now I'll go ahead, rip my ribbing material to its appropriate thickness and cut off the ribs to their proper length. With so many ribs to cut, it makes good sense to use a stop lock on your miter saw. Now eventually, once we get the fixed portion located properly, we're going to need to provide clearance for our miter gauge bar. So in that area on our fixed portion, we want to triple up on our ribbing. And that way when we cut through this skin to create that clearance cut, we'll have some support there. So I've carefully laid out the center position for each of my 2 miter slots, transferred those marks on top of my skin, and then laid out the locations where I want the 3 pieces of ribbing material. Now we're all ready for some assembly. Start out by applying glue along one edge of one of your longer ribs. Then tack it in place with some 1-inch brads. Try to hold it flush against the outside edge of the plywood skin. Now we can go ahead and start putting in the short ribbing. Again, glue and brads. And now we can glue and nail in the other long rib. Now before putting on the top skin, I want to mark the location where each of my ribs are. And that'll just help us out a little bit later on during another step. And now we can glue on the top skin. After you get it lined up, go ahead and tack the skin down in place. Now the only place you don't want to use any metal fasteners are where we tripled up on those internal ribs. Now remember, we're going to be milling out a clearance slot for our miter gauge in those locations, so don't put any fasteners there. As we're not using a stock splitter and blade guard, we don't have to concern ourselves with the cutout that's going to be needed. Now if you are using that stock blade guard and splitter, you'll have to very carefully position your shelf in its location and then provide a cutout in this area to accommodate it and to provide clearance. Now we also have to provide clearance for these 2 large bolts. Again, all I'll do is position my shelf where it's supposed to be, lining up the edges, or the ends rather, flush with the ends of the saw, and then I'll just wrap it with a mallet, and that'll transfer a hole location into the edge of our fixed shelf. Now I can take a Forstner bit and create a clearance hole for that. Now what we need to do is address the situation of getting our fixed shelf attached to the saw. Now we've got this nice piece of angle iron here, which is a great starting point, and we're going to use that with some number 8 by 1 inch long sheet metal screws, and we'll come up through this angle plate into the undersurface of our shelf. And we'll want 3 locations. Now we should try and line that up with the ribs that are inside of our shelf. So I've already transferred those locations down onto here, and I've gone in 3/4 of an inch from this outside edge to where I want to drill the hole. Now a number 8 screw is about 160 thousandths in diameter, so we're going to use an 11/64 inch drill bit to drill the clearance hole. Start by taking a center punch and creating a dimple. That'll give the drill a place to start at. I've chucked up my drill bit in my 1/2 inch drill motor. By using the 1/2 inch drill motor, that keeps the RPM on the drill bit low enough where I'm not going to burn up the drill as we drill through this metal. Now if you have one of these single flute countersinks, they can be used to chamfer the holes. Now what I'm doing is going through and trying to fit up my shelf against the saw. I want to make sure that my fixed shelf does not stand proud of the table saw's surface. So I've clamped a couple of straight edges on the saw, and now I'm sliding this fixed shelf in on top of that angle iron. At that end, I'm in good shape. At this end, I can't quite get it in far enough. So what I need to do is sand on the bottom surface over here of the fixed shelf until this fits in nicely. While I'm sanding this surface of the fixed shelf to make it fit in here, I'm also going to round over this edge with the sander. You'll notice that on the angle iron there's a radiused inside corner here. So in order for this to fit up tight, we need to provide clearance for that radius. Now with our fixed shelf fitting up nice against the back edge of the saw, what I want to do is transfer the exact position of the 2 miter slots out onto that fixed shelf so we can cut the clearance slots. Now at this point, at that end, or operator's view, the right edge of the saw I've got lined up flush between the end of the saw and the end of our fixed shelf. So now I'll just take a straight edge, line that up, and pencil in my marks. Now if your miter gauge slot is T-shaped like this one, be sure to cut away enough material here to accommodate for the entire miter gauge, including that little tab that fits inside the T-slot. Using a 1-inch diameter router bit that's set a little bit deeper than my miter gauge slots, I'm now ready to cut out these slots. Using a clamp-on straight edge guide should make this operation go nice and easy. And that fits up good. We've got plenty of clearance there, so we don't have to worry about the fixed table interfering with the operation of our miter gauge. And I've also got plenty of clearance underneath. I've gone through, sanded it up, and now we're ready to start attaching the fixed shelf to the saw. As you can see, I've got the fixed portion of the outfeed table clamped in place. I've got it lined up flush with the top edge of the saw. Everything's clamped in place. Now what we need to do is affix it there. On the right end of the saw, I'm going to be using 1/8 inch thick by 2 inch wide aluminum. Now I have a mounting bracket that goes here to hold up my overarm blade guard. Otherwise, I could have just used wood in this application. However, this is my restriction, so I went to the hardware store, picked up the aluminum. Now I'll cut it to length and drill a couple holes to mount it up. File takes off the burrs real easy on this soft aluminum. To attach the aluminum, I'm going to be using number 8 by 1 inch sheet metal screws, so I'll drill out the holes to 11/64. Because this aluminum is going to have a tendency to grab, make sure you clamp it down good and secure. Now we can attach everything using number 8 by 1 inch sheet metal screws. We need to add a couple of diagonal braces at the back of the saw that go underneath our fixed table and rest on top of the sheet metal base of the saw. Now I'll be using 1.5 inch square oak for my legs, or these braces rather. Now I've ripped up some material. It's hardboard, 1/4 inch thick, and I've ripped it to 1.5 inch wide. And what I want to do is make a template. I'd rather mess around with this cheap hardboard rather than my oak. Now the first thing I'm going to do is rest one corner on top of that sheet metal base, bring up the other end, and I'm going to draw a line out representing the bottom surface of our outfeed table. Now what I'll do is go over to the compound miter saw, match up that angle and cut it off. Now I am going to cut it off a little bit long at this point because we will have to fit this in there. My angle turned out to be about 23 degrees. Now what I'll do is I'll align this cut end on the undersurface of our table. I'll slide it over to the end of my sheet metal base on the table saw and make another pencil mark. And that will tell me how long to cut this off. Now the other end will be cut at the same angle and they'll be running parallel to each other. Now with both ends cut, I can position it in place and slide it in. And it should just start to come up underneath our outfeed table. Now what we want to do is cut a 90-degree angle to the angle on the bottom that we just cut. Now my sheet metal base stands proud of the cabinet of the saw by about 3/8 of an inch. So that much of the original angle I want to leave. Now using a square, I'll line that up on my mark and draw out another line. Of course that would be 90 degrees to that angle we just cut. Now I can go over to the bandsaw and cut away this waste material. Now with the brace in place, we can see that we still got a little bit of gap up near the top end of this angle. However, in my case, that worked out real well because up here at the top, you'll see that I need to go in a little bit further. So if I just cut it off a little bit shorter, it should fit up perfect. And we'll see how that fits up. Not bad at all. We're going back about a 1/16 of an inch. We're good and tight and flush along the back edge near the bottom, and we're flush along the undersurface of our table. Now we've got our template and we can make our braces out of the oak. Just line the template up nice and flush. Mark our angles on both ends. The center to center distance of my miter slots is 10 5/8. Now I want my two braces to be right on those center line points because we're going to attach it where we put in that triple thick ribbing in this area. Now to get that distance, I needed to subtract 1.5 inches, so that left me with 9 1/8 inches long for our cross bracing. Now it's just 3/4 inch thick oak, 2.5 inches wide, and cut off to 9 1/8 long. Now we'll join these pieces together using pocket hole screws. 2 screws on each end of these cross braces, and we should be in good shape. Now these little cross braces will attach to the inside edges of our long diagonal supports. We'll come in 4.5 inches from each end and place them there. And they'll be flush with the outside edge, or rather the outside face. Before attaching the other diagonal brace, I'm going to prop everything in place, clamp it together, and then I'll tighten up the screws. To attach our diagonal bracing, I'm going to be using a pocket hole screw, one at the top of each of the two braces. Near the bottom end, we'll need to do a little bit of layout there. We'll show you that in a minute. Near the bottom end, I'll be using some 1.5 long number 8 sheet metal screws. So I'll need to drill an 11/64 inch clearance hole for the screw. Now I do want to try and keep that drilled hole square to this tapered surface back here. And with our layout mark for the sheet metal screws already on the piece, we can use that as a guide to drill these holes by hand. Now before attaching your cross bracing, tighten up the sheet metal screws that are going up through the angle iron and into our fixed shelf. That will make sure everything's good and flat and aligned properly before we put in that diagonal brace. The sheet metal screws that I'm using are not self-drilling, so what I need to do is transfer their location into the sheet metal, and then I can pre-drill it. Using an 1/8 inch drill, we can finish up the holes. And we can tighten up the pocket hole screws on our diagonal brace to complete the installation of the fixed shelf.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you truly enjoyed it, please help us share this information with the rest of the communities. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and be sure to tell your friends about this channel. Thanks again for watching.